My life was a study in beige. The walls of my cubicle, the folders in my filing cabinets, the weak coffee I drank from a stained ceramic mug. It was all a monotonous, soul-crushing beige. I was an archivist for a company so large and labyrinthine that I was fairly certain half the executives on the top floor didn't know my department existed. We were the keepers of corporate memory, buried in a sub-basement where the only natural light was a rumor. I was a ghost in the machine, a silent custodian of forgotten histories, and most days, I felt as faded and brittle as the documents I handled. Loneliness wasn't an event for me. It was the climate. A low-pressure system that had settled over my life so long ago I'd forgotten what sunshine felt like. Then there was him. His name was Elias Thorne. I knew this from the small, silver nameplate pinned to the crisp, dark blue fabric of his security uniform. He worked the evening shift, a silent sentinel who materialized when the daytime cacophony of the office building bled away into hushed stillness. He was the polar opposite of my beige existence. He was all sharp lines and solid presence, a being of quiet authority and deep, resonant colors. His hair was the black of turned earth, his eyes a dark, watchful gray like a stormy sky. He didn't walk so much as patrol, his steps measured and silent on the polished marble of the lobby, his posture an unyielding line of strength. For 6 months, my observation of him had been my only secret, my only thrill. It was a pathetic little ritual. I would invent reasons to stay late, to be the last one out of my department, just for the fleeting possibility of an interaction. A nod, a quiet murmur of "Good night, Mr. Hart." My heart would perform a frantic, clumsy pirouette in my chest every time. I would dissect these micro-interactions for hours afterward, replaying the slight tilt of his head or the way his eyes seemed to hold mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I was a scholar of Elias Thorne, and my field of study was composed entirely of wishful thinking. The catalyst for change, when it came, arrived not with a bang, but with a corporate memo. A massive, building-wide data migration project was being initiated. My department, the dusty heart of the company's records, was central to the operation. The memo, written in the soulless jargon of upper management, essentially translated to one thing for me: endless nights and weekends spent in the tomb-like silence of the archives. For most of my colleagues, this was a death sentence. For me, it was a reprieve. It was a legitimate, unimpeachable excuse to exist in the same space as him, under the quiet blanket of the night. The first night of the project felt different. The building, usually just emptying out as I packed up, was already a hollow shell by the time I took the elevator down to the archives. The air carried the scent of industrial cleaner and the low hum of the servers, a sound I usually found oppressive but now felt like the backdrop to a clandestine meeting. I told myself to be calm, to act normal. I was just an employee working late. Nothing more. But my hands were slick with a nervous sweat, and my stomach was a tangled knot of anticipation and dread. He was at the security console when the elevator doors slid open to the lobby. The vast, empty space seemed to amplify his presence. He wasn't looking at the bank of monitors, but down at a worn paperback he held in one large hand. The overhead lights caught the sharp angles of his face, casting his cheekbones in shadow. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable, and the book was closed with a soft thud. I saw the cover for a brief second. It was a collection of poetry. The detail was so unexpected, so incongruous with the stoic man in the uniform, that it momentarily short-circuited my brain. "Working late, Mr. Hart?" His voice was just as I remembered it from our fleeting encounters, a low, calm rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between us. It was a voice that could soothe a panic or command a riot with equal ease. "Leo," I corrected, my own voice coming out thinner than I'd hoped. "Please. And yes, big project. I'll probably be setting up a cot down in the archives for the next few months." I attempted a wry smile, but it felt like a grimace. Awkward humor was my default defense mechanism, a flimsy shield against the world. A corner of his mouth ticked upward. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the most expression I had ever seen on his face. "We'll try to avoid that. Let me know if you need anything. Coffee runs out in the break room around 10, but I keep a personal stash." He gestured with his head toward a small locker behind the desk. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, my heart thumping a stupid, hopeful rhythm. "Thank you, Elias." Using his first name felt like a transgression, a step over an invisible line. But he simply nodded, his gray eyes holding mine for a beat. In that moment, I saw something flicker in their depths. It wasn't warmth, not exactly. It was attention, a focused, deliberate attention that made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, seen. He watched me as I swiped my card to enter the stairwell to the sub-basement, and I felt the weight of his gaze on my back the entire way down. The beige world was beginning to show color at the edges. The nights settled into a new kind of routine. My days were still a blur of paperwork and digital files, but my evenings became a quiet vigil. The archives were a vast, silent labyrinth of rolling shelves and cardboard boxes, the air thick with the dry, sweet scent of aging paper. I'd work for hours, lost in the meticulous task of cataloging, until the silence would start to feel heavy, pressing in on me. Then, I would hear it. The soft, rhythmic sound of his footsteps in the corridor above, the faint jingle of keys on his belt. It was the sound of his rounds. I would stop whatever I was doing and listen, tracking his progress through the building like a man mapping constellations. I learned the cadence of his walk, the precise moment he would pause outside the fire door at the top of my stairwell. Sometimes, the door would creak open, and he would call down, "Everything all right, Leo?" His voice would echo slightly in the concrete well, a grounding presence in the echoing quiet. "All good down here." I'd call back, my voice always a little too loud, a little too eager. Just me and the ghosts of quarterly reports past. I'd hear that soft huff of air that I was beginning to recognize as his version of a laugh. Then the door would click shut, and the footsteps would recede. These brief exchanges were the highlights of my night. I would replay them in my mind, analyzing his tone, his choice of words. It was pathetic, I knew. I was a grown man, and I was mooning over the night watchman like a teenager with a crush. But it was also the only thing that made the crushing loneliness of my existence bearable. I took to watching him on the security feed. My terminal had access to a few of the public cameras for asset tracking purposes. I'd tile the lobby and hallway feeds into a small window in the corner of my screen while I worked. It felt illicit, a violation of some unspoken code, but I couldn't stop myself. I watched him stand at the main console, his posture relaxed but alert. I watched him handle a late-night delivery with quiet efficiency. I watched him talk to the cleaning crew, a genuine, fleeting smile appearing when one of the older women, Maria, handed him a pastry from a paper bag. He was a part of the building's nocturnal ecosystem, a steady, constant presence that I orbited from my subterranean cave. One night, I was wrestling with a particularly heavy box of financial records from the 90s. I had it hoisted awkwardly in my arms, trying to slide it onto a high shelf, when my foot slipped on a loose sheet of paper. The box tilted, my balance vanished, and I stumbled backward with a startled yelp, bracing for the impact of the floor and the subsequent paper avalanche. But the impact never came. Instead, strong hands clamped onto my arms, steadying me. The box was lifted from my grasp with an ease that was almost insulting. I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs, and found myself chest to chest with Elias. He was so close I could smell the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent and the sharper, more personal scent of his skin, something like cedar and cool night air. "Careful," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. He placed the box effortlessly onto the high shelf I'd been struggling with. His arms flexed, the muscles in his forearms bunching under the fabric of his uniform shirt. Thank you," I stammered, acutely aware of how close we were standing. The aisle was narrow, but not this narrow. He wasn't moving back. His hands were still resting lightly on my upper arms, his thumbs tracing small, almost imperceptible circles against my shirt. My entire nervous system was on fire. I couldn't breathe. This is it. This is the moment I analyze for the next 6 weeks. Is he just being helpful? Or is this something more? My brain was a frantic mess of hope and self-doubt. He looked down at me, his gray eyes searching my face. I felt stripped bare under that gaze, as if he could see every lonely thought, every pathetic fantasy I'd ever had about him. His expression was serious, intense. "You should ask for help with these," he said, his voice soft. "You're going to hurt yourself." His hands dropped from my arms, and the loss of contact was like a sudden plunge in temperature. He took a small step back, putting a more respectable distance between us. The moment, whatever it had been, was over. Right? Yes. Of course, I said, my voice hoarse. I felt like an idiot. Of course he was just being helpful. He was a security guard. It was his job to prevent accidents. I'm heading up, he said, his tone back to its usual professional calm. Lock up when you're done. He gave me one last look, a long, unreadable appraisal, before turning and heading up the stairs. I stood there for a full 5 minutes after he left, my body buzzing with the phantom sensation of his touch, my mind replaying the moment on an endless, torturous loop. The touch had been fleeting, ambiguous, and utterly devastating. It was a new piece of data to be filed away and overanalyzed in the lonely archive of my mind. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing escalation of these small moments. A hand lingering on my shoulder as he passed behind my chair to check a fire extinguisher. His fingers brushing mine as he handed me a mug of the personal stash coffee he'd offered, a dark, rich brew that tasted infinitely better than the beige sludge from the break room. One evening, I found a chocolate bar sitting on my keyboard with a small, folded note that simply said, "Long night." There was no signature, but I knew. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the note, treating it like a precious artifact. Each touch, each small gesture, was a breadcrumb, and I was following the trail deeper into a forest of my own making, unsure if it led to a welcoming cabin or a cliff's edge. My internal analysis went into overdrive. I oscillated wildly between the giddy certainty that he felt something, too, and the crushing despair that I was just a sad, lonely man projecting his own desires onto the first kind person to show him a modicum of attention. He was just being nice. That was the most logical explanation, and the most painful one. The work on the data migration project was relentless. I was tired down to my bones, my eyes gritty from staring at screens, and my back aching from lifting boxes. But I never complained. The exhaustion was a small price to pay for these stolen moments of proximity to Elias. He was my anchor in the long, silent nights, a fixed point of quiet strength. The fire alarm shattered the silence at 2:17 in the morning. One moment, I was drowsing over a spreadsheet. The next, a piercing siren was screaming through the building, accompanied by the flash of emergency strobes. I jolted awake, my heart seizing in my chest. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. I was in a sub-basement, a concrete box buried under a 50-story skyscraper. Before I could fully spiral, the fire door at the top of the stairs slammed open. "Leo," Elias's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Let's go." Now, I scrambled for my keys and wallet, my movements clumsy with adrenaline. I met him at the bottom of the stairs, and he immediately placed a firm hand on my back, propelling me forward. "It's probably a false alarm," he said, his voice close to my ear to be heard over the din. "Sensor malfunction on the 34th floor. But we follow protocol. No exceptions." His touch was grounding, a solid point of contact in the chaos. He led me through a series of emergency corridors I never knew existed, his movements efficient and sure. We were the only two people in this entire section of the building. The alarm seemed to echo the frantic beating of my own heart. When we finally emerged into the cool night air of the designated assembly point, the silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. We stood on the empty plaza, the massive glass and steel tower looming over us, its emergency lights painting strange, dancing patterns on the ground. A few other late-night workers from different sections of the building were straggling out, but we were alone in our corner. "You okay?" Elias asked, turning to face me. The flashing lights caught in his dark hair, and his face was a mask of concern. "Yeah," I breathed, my adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a shaky exhaustion in its wake. "Just a little rattled." "I hate that sound. Nobody likes it," he said. He didn't move away. He stood close, a silent, protective presence. We lapsed into a comfortable silence, watching as the fire department arrived, their own lights adding to the chaotic display. "You're always so calm," I said after a few minutes, the observation slipping out before I could stop it. He looked over at me, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "It's the job. Panic doesn't help anyone. You learn to just assess, act, and breathe." He paused, his gaze turning back to the building. "My dad was a cop. He taught me that. Stay calm on the outside, even if you're churning on the inside." It was the first truly personal thing he had ever told me. A small crack in the stoic facade. I felt an absurd surge of gratitude, as if he had handed me a precious gift. "Is that why you took this job?" I asked, feeling bolder than I had any right to be. "Because of your dad." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the skyscraper. "No," he said finally, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I took this job because it's quiet. It gives me time to think, to study." He glanced at me, a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "People see the uniform and they make assumptions. They think you're either a failed cop or you're just not smart enough for anything else. I don't think that," I said quickly, my voice earnest. "I saw you reading poetry that first night." His eyes widened slightly in surprise, and he looked genuinely taken aback. "You noticed that?" "I noticed things," I admitted, a blush creeping up my neck. "It's part of my job, I guess." The details. He held my gaze, and the professional distance between us seemed to dissolve completely, washed away by the flashing emergency lights and the shared vulnerability of the moment. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, standing on a small, quiet island in a sea of chaos. "What else do you notice, Leo?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. A door was opening, and I was terrified to walk through it. I could make a joke, deflect, retreat back into the safety of my beige world. Or I could be brave, for once in my life. I took a breath. "I notice you make your rounds at the same time every night. I notice you always have a kind word for the cleaning crew. And I notice," my voice dropped to a near whisper, "that you always seem to find a reason to check on the archives when I'm working late." The silence that followed was absolute. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elias didn't look away. His gray eyes were dark and intense, searching my face for something. I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He opened his mouth to say something, but just then a firefighter gave the all clear, and the moment was shattered. The spell was broken. We were just two coworkers standing outside our office building after a false alarm. The walk back inside was silent and awkward. The charged intimacy of our conversation lingered in the air, a tangible thing. We rode the elevator up to the lobby together, the space between us humming with everything that had been left unsaid. When the doors opened, he turned to me. "Good night, Leo," he said, his voice back to its usual calm, but his eyes told a different story. They were still holding onto the intensity of our conversation on the plaza. "Good night, Elias," I replied, and for the first time, it felt like we were both saying so much more. I went back to my work in the archives, but I couldn't concentrate. The beige had been irrevocably stripped away, revealing a world of vibrant, terrifying color beneath. And I knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and petrifying, that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension between us in the following weeks was a living entity. It walked the halls with us, rode the elevator, and sat in the quiet spaces of our brief conversations. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken knowledge. The question was no longer if something was happening between us, but when it would finally break the surface. Every interaction was loaded, every glance heavy with subtext. He started leaving coffee on my desk every night, not just when I looked tired. I started leaving him a newspaper, open to the crossword puzzle, which I'd noticed him working on during his breaks. They were small, silent offerings, admissions of a connection we couldn't yet name. The tipping point arrived on a Friday, at the end of a brutal, soul-crushing week. I had been in the office for 14 straight hours. My brain felt like scrambled eggs, and my only goal was to get to my apartment and collapse. I packed my bag, the exhaustion of physical weight on my shoulders, and headed for the elevator. As I waited, the door slid open and Elias was inside, his shift clearly just ending. He wasn't in his uniform, but in a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. The sight of him in civilian clothes was strangely intimate, like seeing a teacher outside of school. The t-shirt stretched across his broad chest, and for a moment, I just stared, my tired brain forgetting how to form words. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft. He held the door for me. "The longest," I sighed, stepping inside. Before the doors could close, another man stumbled in, reeking of expensive scotch and entitlement. I recognized him instantly. Mr. Abernathy, a senior vice president from the 48th floor, a man known for his abrasive personality and his wandering hands at the company Christmas party. "Working the little people to the bone, I see." Abernathy slurred. clapping me on the shoulder with unnecessary force. He leered, his eyes glassy. "You know, you should smile more, son. You're too pretty to look so morose." He let his hand slide down my back, coming to rest on my waist. I froze, my entire body going rigid. A familiar, sickening cocktail of shame and anger washed over me. This wasn't the first time I'd dealt with men like Abernathy. My usual response was to shrink, to make myself smaller, to endure it until it was over. But this time was different. Elias was there. I didn't look at him, but I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The air grew cold, heavy. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Elias take a half step forward, placing his body slightly between me and Abernathy. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence was a shield, a silent, menacing warning. Abernathy, drunk and oblivious, didn't seem to notice. He squeezed my waist. "Got big plans for the weekend? A hot date with your roommate?" He gave a wet, knowing chuckle. The homophobic sneer was unmistakable. I saw Elias's jaw tighten, a muscle bunching in his cheek. His hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, curled into fists. The silence in the elevator was suddenly immense, a physical pressure. The elevator dinged, mercifully arriving at Abernathy's parking level. He removed his hand, gave me a final, greasy wink, and stumbled out of the car. "Have a good one, ladies," he called over his shoulder as the doors slid shut. We were alone. The air was thick with the ghost of Abernathy's cheap cologne and his even cheaper bigotry. I stared at the closed doors, my face burning with humiliation. I felt small, exposed, and pathetic. Elias didn't say anything for a long moment. The only sound was the low hum of the elevator as it continued its descent to the main lobby. I risked a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire I had never seen before. "Does that happen a lot?" he finally asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The question was a perfectly aimed arrow, and it struck me right in the heart. He wasn't just asking about Abernathy. He was asking about all the Abernathy's. He was asking about the quiet indignities, the casual cruelties, the constant, low-level fear that was the background radiation of my life. He was asking to see the part of me I kept hidden from everyone. Sometimes, I mumbled, my gaze fixed on the floor. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't bear to see pity in his eyes. "You shouldn't have to put up with that," he said, his voice a low growl. It wasn't pity. It was anger. A pure, protective anger that was entirely on my behalf. The force of it stunned me. No one had ever been angry for me before. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors slid open with a soft chime. The moment was over. I practically fled from the elevator, desperate to escape the intensity of the enclosed space, the intensity of his gaze. "Leo," he called after me. I stopped but didn't turn around. "Have a good weekend," he said softly. It sounded less like a pleasantry and more like a command, a plea for me to find some peace after what had just happened. I just nodded, unable to speak, and pushed my way out into the night, my heart a chaotic drum against my ribs. The encounter had stripped away the last of our pretenses. He had seen me at my most vulnerable, and he hadn't flinched. He had stood his ground. He had stood my ground. And I knew, with terrifying certainty, that the next time we were alone, the dam of our unspoken feelings would finally break. The weekend was a blur of anxiety. I replayed the elevator scene with Abernathy 100 times, but my thoughts always circled back to Elias. His quiet fury, the protective shift of his body, the raw concern in his voice. I barely slept, oscillating between a thrilling hope and a deep-seated fear. What if I had imagined it all? What if his anger was just the professional concern of a security officer for an employee's well-being? My capacity for self-doubt was truly bottomless. By the time Monday night rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. Walking into the building felt like walking onto a stage. I avoided the main lobby, taking a side entrance and heading straight for the archives, my head down. I couldn't face him. Not yet. I needed to hide in my beige sanctuary and try to regain some semblance of composure. But there was no escaping it. The knowledge of what had passed between us was a physical presence in the building. I worked on autopilot, my mind anywhere but on the digital files in front of me. I kept listening for his footsteps, for the sound of his rounds, but the hours ticked by in unnerving silence. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I packed my things, my hands shaking slightly, and steeled myself for the inevitable walk through the lobby. I called the elevator and waited, my stomach churning. The doors opened. It was empty. A wave of both disappointment and relief washed over me. I stepped inside and pushed the button for the lobby. The doors closed, sealing me in the small, sterile box. The elevator began its ascent, moving smoothly past the floors. Sub-basement. Basement. Then, with a sudden, metallic groan, it juddered to a violent halt. The lights flickered once, twice, then stayed on, but the car was motionless. I stumbled, catching myself on the handrail. My heart leaped into my throat. I was trapped. I stared at the panel. The floor indicator was dark. We were stuck between floors. I took a shaky breath, my mind racing. I was about to press the emergency call button when I heard a soft click from the other side of the car. I turned. Elias was standing there. He hadn't been in the elevator when I got on. He must have been in the other car, the one connected in the same shaft, and used an override key. My mind struggled to process this. He had stopped the elevator. On purpose. He looked at me, his face grim, his gray eyes dark and unreadable. The air in the small space was suddenly thick, electric. He took a step toward me, and then another. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I can't do this anymore, Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper that seemed to scrape against my nerve endings. "Do what?" I breathed, my back pressing against the cool metal wall of the elevator. My mind was blank with a terrifying, exhilarating panic. "This," he said, his voice laced with a frustration that seemed to have been simmering for months. "This pretending, the quiet nods, the coffee, watching you from the cameras. I can't just stand by and watch guys like Abernathy put their hands on you. I can't just be the night watchman anymore." My breath hitched. It was all real. Every hope, every fantasy, every overanalyzed glance. It was all real. He raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was hesitant at first, as if he was afraid I might bolt. Then, as I leaned into his hand, his touch grew more confident. His thumb stroked my cheek, sending shivers down my spine. "I spend my entire shift waiting to hear your footsteps," he confessed, his voice raw with an emotion I couldn't name. "Just for a 5-second conversation. It's driving me insane." He leaned in, pinning me against the wall with his body. Not with force, but with a firm, undeniable presence that left me no room to escape. Not that I wanted to. One hand rested on the wall next to my head. The other came to rest on my hip, his fingers splaying out over the fabric of my trousers. The scent of him, cedar and clean cotton and something uniquely, intoxicatingly him, filled my senses. This is happening. Right now. I am not dreaming. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth. My lips parted on a silent, shaky breath. And then, with a low groan that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul, he lowered his head and kissed me. The kiss was not gentle. It was a dam-breaking. It was months of stolen glances and unspoken words and simmering tension erupting in a single, desperate moment. It was hungry and searching and raw, a bruising confirmation of everything we had both been too afraid to say. I melted against him, my hands coming up to grip his shoulders, holding on as if the world were tilting on its axis. He pulled back slightly, just enough to speak, his forehead resting against mine. His breathing was ragged, his eyes were closed. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick. And then his hand moved from my hip. My eyes flew open as I felt the distinct, metallic sound of my zipper being pulled down. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, panicked bird. His movements were deliberate, sure. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating an intention. He pinned me to the wall, his hips pressing against mine, a firm, undeniable pressure that made my knees weak. The sheer, unapologetic boldness of it stole the air from my lungs. This wasn't a tentative exploration. This was a claiming. A raw, physical confession that bypassed all the awkwardness and uncertainty and went straight for the heart of what we both wanted. The world narrowed to this small, metal box, to the heat of his body, the rasp of his breath, the solid weight of him against me. For the first time in my life, I didn't overthink. I didn't analyze. I just felt. And what I felt was a profound, earth-shattering sense of having finally come home. The moments that followed were a blur of sensation. The rough texture of his jeans against my legs, the surprising softness of his t-shirt under my frantic fingers, His mouth found mine again, deeper this time, a slow, deliberate claiming that sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated want through my entire body. The world outside the elevator ceased to exist. There was only the sound of our breathing, the press of our bodies, the undeniable reality of his hand, warm and sure, closing around me. It was an act of breathtaking intimacy, made all the more potent by its illicit setting. He was breaking every rule, risking his job, and he was doing it for me. When it was over, we stayed pressed together, foreheads touching, chests heaving. My body was trembling with the aftershocks, my mind a complete blank. The silence that descended was different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't tense or awkward. It was sated, complete. Elias was the first to move. He pulled back slowly, his hands coming up to cup my face. He looked at me, his gray eyes dark and soft, filled with a startling tenderness. He searched my face, as if looking for regret, for fear. He found none. All I felt was a profound, bone-deep sense of rightness. He leaned in and gave me a kiss that was the complete opposite of the first one. It was soft, lingering, and unbelievably sweet. It was a promise, a question, an apology. It was everything. Without a word, he reached over and straightened my clothes, his movements gentle and efficient. He then turned to the control panel, inserted his key, and with a soft whir, the elevator began to move again. We rode the last few feet down to the lobby in a profound, altered silence. The doors slid open to the vast, empty marble hall. The world rushed back in, and with it, a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety. What now? What did this mean? Was this a one-time explosion of pent-up feelings, or was it the start of something? My old, familiar panic began to creep back in. Elias seemed to sense it. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip was firm, grounding. He didn't say anything. He just held my hand as he walked me out of the building and all the way to my car in the deserted parking garage. At my car door, he finally stopped and turned to me. The harsh fluorescent lights of the garage cast long shadows across his face. "I'll see you tomorrow, Leo," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He leaned in, kissed me softly one more time, and then he let go of my hand and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the garage. I stood there for a long time, the feel of his lips still tingling on mine, the warmth of his hand still imprinted on my skin. I got in my car and drove home in a daze, my world completely and irrevocably changed between the third and fourth floors. The next day was the longest of my life. I walked into work feeling like I was wearing a flashing neon sign that read, "I made out with the security guard in the elevator." Every glance from a coworker felt like an accusation. Every quiet conversation I passed seemed to be about me. I was a wreck, a bundle of raw, exposed nerves. The morning after was a far cry from the heated certainty of the night before. Doubt, my oldest and most loyal companion, came rushing back in. What had I done? What had he done? He could lose his job. I could lose my job. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe it was just a moment of madness, a chemical reaction to the Abernathy incident. The more I thought, the more my anxiety spiraled. I hid in the archives, avoiding the lobby, avoiding any chance of seeing him. I needed to think, to process, but my brain was just a static-filled mess. I felt the familiar, crushing weight of loneliness descend, heavier this time because I had, for a few brief, stolen moments, felt its absence. By late afternoon, I had worked myself into a state of near panic. I was convinced he would ignore me, that he would be cold and professional, and that last night would become another unmentionable secret, buried in the archives of my memory. I was staring at a document on my screen, not reading a single word, when a shadow fell over my desk. I looked up slowly, my heart in my throat. It was Elias. He was in his uniform, his expression serious. He had come down to the sub-basement. He had sought me out. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded numbly, my throat too tight to speak. I stood and followed him to a small, unused storage room at the back of the archives, a place filled with obsolete computer equipment and the dust of forgotten technology. He closed the door behind us, plunging the small room into semi-darkness, the only light coming from a small, grime-covered window high on the wall. He stood in front of me, not touching me, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked nervous. It was an expression I had never seen on him before, and it did more to calm my own panic than anything else could have. Last night, he began, his voice quiet but clear in the small space. That wasn't a mistake. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. I had to lean against a stack of old monitors to steady myself. He took a step closer. I'm not sorry it happened, Leo. I'm only sorry about the location. And the timing. It wasn't fair to you. I let things get the better of me. He looked down at his feet for a moment, then met my eyes again, his gaze direct and sincere. I've wanted to do that for months. Since the first time I saw you, looking so lost in the lobby, me too. I whispered, the words barely audible. I mean, I've wanted this. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his usually stoic features. It was like watching the sun rise. He closed the remaining distance between us and took my hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. His touch was deliberate, gentle, a stark contrast to the desperate urgency of the night before. I've been watching you too, he admitted, trying to work up the nerve to say something more than good night. Mr. Hart, every time I saw you, you looked so sad, like you were carrying the weight of the world. I just wanted to. He trailed off, searching for the words. What? I prompted softly. I don't know, he said with a soft, self-deprecating laugh. Make you smile, I guess. A real smile. Not that polite, pained thing you do when you think someone's watching. His perception was so sharp, it was almost painful. He saw right through me, past all the beige walls I had built around myself. He saw the loneliness, the sadness, and he wasn't scared off by it. He had moved closer. Just then, the door to the storage room creaked open. We sprang apart, our hands dropping as if burned. Standing in the doorway, a sneer plastered across his face, was Abernathy. Well, he drawled, his eyes darting between me and Elias. What do we have here? A little secret meeting in the dustbin? Knew there was something sweet about you. Hart, my blood ran cold. This was it. The test. The public humiliation I had always dreaded. My first instinct was to shrink, to apologize, to disappear into the floorboards. The old Leo was screaming at me to run. But I wasn't the old Leo. I looked at Elias. He was standing perfectly still, his face a thunderous mask of anger. But he was looking at me, a silent question in his eyes. He was letting me take the lead. Something shifted inside me. A small, hard kernel of defiance. I was so tired of being afraid. I was so tired of men like Abernathy having power over me. I straightened my shoulders and looked the vice president directly in the eye. We were just discussing a security concern, Mr. Abernathy, I said, my voice surprisingly calm and steady. But since you're here, perhaps you can help. We're investigating a pattern of workplace harassment. Do you have anything to contribute? The sneer vanished from Abernathy's face, replaced by a flash of stunned anger, followed quickly by a flicker of fear. He was a bully, and bullies are cowards. He glanced from my cold, steady gaze to Elias's towering, silent menace, and he deflated. I know. I have no idea what you're talking about, he stammered, taking a step back. He shot me one last venomous glare, and then turned and hurried away, his expensive shoes echoing down the corridor. The silence he left behind was profound. I stood there, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a wild, exhilarating surge of victory. I had done it. I had stood up for myself. Elias turned to me, a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face. Leo, he breathed, his voice full of awe. He started it. I said, a shaky but genuine smile finally breaking through. And it was a real smile. I could feel the difference. It reached my eyes. Elias closed the distance between us again, and this time he didn't hesitate. He framed my face with his hands and kissed me, right there in the dusty storage room. It was a kiss of triumph, of relief, of pure, unbridled joy. When he pulled away, he was grinning. Let me take you to dinner tonight, he said, the words a soft rumble against my lips. A real date. Away from this place, I'd like that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I'd like that very much. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate step out of the shadows of our secret, late-night world and into the light. It was terrifying, and it was the most wonderful thing I had ever felt. Elias chose a small, quiet Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street I'd never noticed before. It was the kind of place with checkered tablecloths, candles stuck in old wine bottles, and an owner who greeted regulars with a booming laugh. It was warm and real and a million miles away from the cold, sterile environment where our story had begun. Seeing Elias out of his uniform, sitting across from me in a soft, dark sweater, felt both completely normal and utterly surreal. He looked younger, more relaxed. The weight of his professional responsibility was gone, leaving just the man. We talked for hours. It was easy, effortless. I told him about my quiet life, my love of old books and forgotten histories. He told me about his studies. He was taking online courses in forestry management, of all things. He dreamed of one day working in a national park, of a life surrounded by trees instead of concrete. He spoke of the quiet solitude of the woods with the same reverence I spoke of the silence of the archives. We were two quiet souls who had found each other in a loud world. He listened with an intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person on the planet. He asked questions, real questions, not just polite conversation fillers. He wanted to know what I thought, what I dreamed of. And when I spoke, he watched my face with that same focused attention I had first noticed across the security console months ago. Only now, it wasn't unreadable. It was filled with warmth, with affection, with a tenderness that made my heart ache in the best possible way. After dinner, we walked through the quiet city streets. It was a cool autumn night, and the air was crisp. He took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine without any hesitation. It was a simple, public declaration. We are together. My heart swelled with a feeling so new and overwhelming I couldn't put a name to it. It felt like peace. He walked me to the door of my apartment, a small, unremarkable place that suddenly felt like a palace because he was standing in front of it. The awkward end-of-date dance seemed inevitable. Do I invite him in? Do we just kiss goodnight? My mind started its old, familiar overthinking routine. Elias, as always, cut right through my anxiety. He leaned down and kissed me softly. "I'm not coming in tonight," he said against my lips. "This us. I don't want to rush it. I want to do this right." The consideration, the respect in that statement, was more intimate than anything we had done in the elevator. He wasn't just interested in my body. He was interested in my heart. He was building something with me, not just taking something from me. "Okay," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Okay." He kissed me one more time, a long, slow, promising kiss, and then he left. I went inside and leaned against my closed door, my whole body humming with a quiet, profound joy. For the first time, my apartment didn't feel empty. It felt like a place of beginning. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. Sunlight was streaming through my window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I lay there for a long time, just breathing. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been my companion for as long as I could remember was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness, a sense of calm that felt utterly foreign and deeply welcome. I made coffee and sat by my window, watching the city wake up. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. "Morning. Hope you slept well." A simple message, but it sent a ridiculous, giddy thrill through me. I smiled as I typed back. "Better than I have in years." Well, the story ends here, but it also begins. It begins with a text message on a sunny morning. It begins with making breakfast for two instead of one. It begins with sitting on a porch, or a fire escape, or just a comfortable couch, watching the sunset together in a comfortable silence, his hand resting easily on my knee. It's in the quiet, domestic moments that the real intimacy is forged, a stark and beautiful contrast to the frantic, desperate passion that had ignited us in that metal box between floors. My life is no longer beige. It's the deep, stormy gray of his eyes when he looks at me. It's the warm, steady brown of his hand holding mine. It's the vibrant, hopeful green of a forest he dreams of, a dream that is slowly becoming mine, too. I spent so long feeling like a ghost, a forgotten record in a dusty archive. But Elias saw me. He pulled me from the shelf, blew off the dust, and read my story. He didn't just see me, he made me feel seen. And in doing so, he brought me back to life. I am still an archivist. I am still quiet. I am still prone to overthinking. But I am not lonely. I am not afraid. I look toward the future, and for the first time, I don't see an endless expanse of monotonous beige. I see color. I see hope. I see him. And it feels like I've finally come home.